It began not on a battlefield, but in a workshop, a dim, oil-slicked room where steel met genius. The year was 1918, and the world had just learned that modern war belonged to machines. Airplanes had replaced cavalry, tanks had replaced horses, and the old rifles of 19th century armies were now as useless as bayonets against armor. Into this new age stepped one man, John Moses Browning, a Utah gunsmith whose name had already become legend. His task was simple in words, but impossible in scope. Design a weapon powerful enough to stop the machines that had begun to rule the battlefield. The request came from the U.S. Army Ordnance Department late in World War I. Reports from Europe told of German planes strafing trenches unopposed, of light tanks shrugging off rifle fire, of armored cars driving straight through infantry lines. What the Army needed was not another rifle. It needed a heavy machine gun, one that could throw half-inch bullets capable of tearing through steel, wood, and flesh alike. The French called for a grande mitrailleuse. The Americans called for a heavy 50. Browning simply called it a problem worth solving. Working with the engineers at Colt and Winchester, Browning began to modify his earlier M1917 water-cooled machine gun, scaling it up to handle a new cartridge nearly the size of a man's finger. That round, the 50 BMG Browning machine gun, was a monster, 12.7 millimeters of lead and copper wrapped around 60 grains of powder, a slug that could travel over 2,000 feet per second and punch through an inch of armor. When Browning first fired it at a test range in Hartford, the recoil knocked the entire bench backward. He smiled and said, "Now that's a gun." By 1919, the design had matured into something formidable. The Browning M1921, later refined into the M2 heavy barrel, M2HB. It was air-cooled instead of water-cooled, making it lighter and simpler. The gun fired from a short recoil action, its massive bolt sliding forward with a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. It was not graceful, it was not subtle, but it worked every single time. Browning would not live to see the gun's perfection. He died in 1926, sitting at his workbench in Liège, Belgium, with blueprints of the M2 spread before him. His death marked the end of an era, but his machine lived on. The Browning M2HB became a weapon so reliable, so enduring, that generations of soldiers would call it simply the 50, or, with affection, Ma Deuce. As the years between wars ticked by, the United States Army and its engineers at Colt's Patent Firearms and Frigidaire Manufacturing continued refining the design. They shortened the receiver, thickened the barrel, and adjusted the headspace to prevent jams. Factories in Detroit and Hartford learned to mass-produce the weapon by the thousands. What had once been a prototype became an industry. America, the arsenal of democracy, now possessed a machine gun that could dominate land, sea, and sky. When the first tests were conducted at Aberdeen Proving Ground, witnesses described the sound as a deep mechanical thunder. Unlike the chatter of the .30 caliber Brownings or the high-pitched scream of the German MG-34, the .50 caliber M2 didn't talk, it roared. Each shot was a small explosion, each burst a rolling drumbeat that seemed to shake the ground. The bullets tore through target plates, ripped holes in steel aircraft panels, and shattered engine blocks at 500 yards. The weapon was a force of nature, designed for a century that was about to learn what total war meant. By 1940, as the clouds of World War II gathered, the Browning M2HB had spread across every branch of the U.S. military. The Army mounted it on half-tracks and jeeps. The Navy fixed it to the rails of PT boats and destroyers. The Air Corps filled their bombers with them. 13 on a B-17 Flying Fortress, 10 on a B-24 Liberator, 6 on a P-51 Mustang. The same weapon that could shoot down a fighter plane could also destroy a truck convoy. The .50 caliber was no longer a support gun. It was the backbone of American firepower. In its simplicity lay its brilliance. There were only a handful of moving parts: a bolt, a barrel, a recoil spring, a feed cover, a trigger group. No delicate machining, no unnecessary flourishes. A soldier could strip it blindfolded, clean it in the rain, and have it firing again within minutes. They could withstand sand in Tunisia, salt in the Pacific, and snow in the Ardennes. It was the rare weapon that belonged everywhere and feared nowhere. American soldiers were quick to trust it, and quicker still to love it. They named it, polished it, decorated it with lucky charms. A Marine on Guadalcanal painted Baby Deuce on his gun shield. A tank crew in France welded armor plates around theirs and called it the Widowmaker. To the men behind the trigger, the .50 cal was more than metal. It was survival. And the rest of the world noticed too. German officers examining captured American vehicles in North Africa were shocked to find the same heavy caliber gun mounted on everything from tanks to trucks. "This is no ordinary machine gun," one report to Berlin read. "It is a cannon disguised as one." Japanese naval intelligence called it the American Thunder Gun. Wherever the United States went, the Browning M2HB followed. A mechanical heartbeat of steel and fire. By 1942, as the first American convoys landed in North Africa, the weapon was everywhere, on tanks, trucks, airfields, and ships. Its voice had become the sound of the Allied advance, a deep, booming pulse that rolled from the deserts of Tunisia to the beaches of Normandy. Pilots would later say they could tell when they were flying over American lines because the air below shimmered with red tracer arcs, the calling card of the .50 cal. The weapon was not elegant. It did not whisper. It did not hesitate. It simply did what Browning had designed it to do: dominate the battlefield. From that moment on, no Allied soldier would ever feel unarmed, no matter what he rode or where he fought, as long as the Medusa was with him. And soon, as the skies over Europe and the Pacific began to fill with fire, the world would learn what it meant to face an army that carried thunder on every wheel, every wing, and every heart that refused to yield. By the time the United States plunged fully into war in 1942, the Browning M2 HB .50 caliber had already become more than just a weapon. It was a doctrine. Its booming voice echoed from every corner of the globe, welded to jeeps, tanks, trucks, ships, bombers, and airfields. Wherever American forces went, the deep thud of the Ma Deuce followed, a sound so distinct that friend and foe alike could identify it from miles away. The battlefield no longer had front lines, it had zones of .50 caliber fire. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of the Pacific, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the M2HB adapted to every climate, every mission, and every branch of service. It wasn't just versatile, it was omnipresent. There was hardly a vehicle in the U.S. arsenal that didn't have one bolted somewhere to its frame. In Tunisia, 1943, the Army's half-tracks carried twin-mounted .50 cals on rotating turrets, using them to mow down German infantry that tried to flank the columns. Soldiers described the sound as a metal heartbeat, pulsing in rhythm with the advance of the armored divisions. The M2HB could chew through walls, trees, and the thin armor of trucks or reconnaissance cars. Even German SDKF-222 armored cars, which had once terrified Allied patrols, found their armor perforated like tin when struck by the .50's heavy rounds. Tankers loved it. On the Sherman, the M2HB was usually mounted above the commander's hatch, its barrel stretching proudly toward the horizon. Though exposed to sniper fire, commanders often stood half out of their turrets, gripping the handles and sweeping the road ahead with tracer fire. A single burst could shred an enemy machine gun nest or punch holes through the sides of a Panzer's engine compartment. When the tank's main gun was reloading, the .50 kept firing, relentless, steady, unbreakable. On the ground, It became the infantry's guardian. Jeeps fitted with pedestal mounts roamed ahead of convoys like wasps, their M2s spitting fire at ambush points. Some units of the 82nd Airborne and Rangers turned the weapon into a mobile fortress, building improvised gun trucks with sandbags, armor plating, and 2 or 3 Brownings chained together. They called them meat choppers. And in ambushes along narrow roads, they lived up to the name. In Normandy, the gun reached its full, terrifying potential. During the breakout from the beaches in June 1944, the American advance was slowed by the infamous bocage, dense hedgerows and stone walls that turned every field into a trap. German machine guns, hidden in barns and trenches, pinned down entire platoons. The .50 cal became the equalizer. Engineers mounted them on bulldozers and half-tracks to blow holes through the hedgerows, cutting new paths while suppressing enemy fire. When the .50s opened up, one paratrooper recalled, the walls just crumbled. It was like watching thunder tear the earth. Even the Luftwaffe pilots flying overhead could tell when they were crossing Allied lines. They reported seeing fields of fire, endless streaks of red tracers arcing upward from every direction. It wasn't flak guns. It was the same heavy machine gun that armed American bombers, only now thousands of them pointed back at the sky. In the Pacific, the Marines carried the Ma-Deuce ashore on amphibious tractors and landing craft. On the beaches of Tarawa and Saipan, they learned that the weapon could cut through palm trees, bunkers, and even the concrete walls of Japanese pillboxes. When flamethrowers ran dry, the .50 kept pounding. A Marine gunner on Tarawa described the sensation. It wasn't like shooting, it was like commanding lightning. The Navy took the Browning to sea. Ships bristled with twin and quad mounts, lining the decks like teeth. When Japanese dive bombers swooped in low, the M2s filled the air with tracer fire so dense it seemed solid. Kamikaze pilots would later call it the Red Curtain. The same gun that had guarded a Jeep in Normandy now defended an aircraft carrier in the Pacific. The design was universal. The result was chaos for any enemy that dared to approach. What made the M2HB truly unstoppable wasn't just its range or power, it was its reliability. The gun could function in any condition: desert dust, jungle humidity, ocean spray, or blizzard cold. Soldiers joked that it could survive the end of the world and keep firing. Its air-cooled barrel meant no need for water jackets or hoses, and it could switch from single-shot precision to roaring bursts by the flick of a small lever. It was as close to perfection as a machine gun could get. It also became a symbol of American industrial might. The same factories that built refrigerators and typewriters now turned out M2HBs by the hundreds of thousands. Over 2 million units were produced during the war, their parts interchangeable, their blueprint simple enough that any mechanic could repair one in the field. Soldiers carried spare barrels, bolts, and recoil springs in canvas bags, swapping them out in minutes. The gun had become more than just a piece of equipment. It was a system, a mechanical organism that sustained itself through the hands of its users. And soon that voice would grow even louder as German pilots over France and Japanese airmen over the Pacific discovered the truth for themselves, that the sky itself now belonged to the .50 caliber. By the summer of 1944, the skies over Europe had changed. The Luftwaffe pilots, who once swooped low and strafed American convoys with impunity, now faced something new, a thunderstorm that came from below. It wasn't flat guns or artillery. It was everywhere, all at once, coming from the roofs of barns, from half-tracks hidden in hedgerows, from jeeps bouncing along muddy roads. It was the same heavy machine gun that had guarded bombers in the sky, now mounted on every vehicle below. The Browning M2HB 50 caliber. German flyers began calling it Der Rote Regen, the Red Rain. For when they dived to attack, the air filled with streaks of red tracers that rose in sheets, crossing and weaving like threads of light. A single M2 was dangerous. A dozen firing together created a storm that no pilot could outfly. The 50 caliber's range reached 1.5 miles. Its bullet, weighing nearly 2 ounces, could punch through aluminum fuselages and engine blocks with terrifying ease. Against that, speed and skill were no defense. The first German units to feel its full fury were those of the Luftwaffe Jagdbombergruppen, fighter bombers flying the rugged FW-190 and U-87 in low-level attacks on the Normandy beachhead. On June 9, 1944, a formation of FW-190s descended on an American supply column near Carrington. They expected light resistance. What they found instead were quad-mounted 50 cals on half-tracks, 4 barrels each, rotating on electric turrets, spitting red fire into the morning mist. The first aircraft caught a burst through the engine cowling, exploded mid-dive, and crashed into field. The rest turned away, leaving behind a curtain of smoke and disbelief. A German survivor later said, "It was not flak, it was 1,000 guns with one voice." As the Allied armies pushed inland, that voice became omnipresent. Every convoy, every artillery battery, every fuel dump bristled with 50 cals. Even medics' vehicles and kitchen trucks mounted them. When the Luftwaffe tried to harass night convoys, the entire column would open fire at once, hundreds of red arcs rising into the dark. To pilots looking down, it seemed as though the earth itself had caught fire. In Belgium, during the winter battles of the Ardennes, German Me-109s tried to strafe the supply lines leading to Bastogne. They never made a second pass. The air was too thick with tracers. Ground gunner had learned to coordinate their fire, sweeping the sky in slow, deliberate bursts. The M2HB's rhythm, slower than the MG-42 but heavier, deeper, carried across the frozen fields like the tolling of a massive bell. When a plane fell, the men didn't cheer. They simply reloaded. Meanwhile, across the world in the Pacific, Japanese pilots were learning the same terrible lesson. The Imperial Navy had once ruled the skies with its graceful A6M0 fighters, darting low over landing beaches to strafe Marines and bomb supply dumps. But on islands like Tarawa, Peleliu, and Saipan, the beaches were lined with LVT-A4 amphibious tractors, each armed with a Browning 50 caliber. When the Zeros appeared, the Marines turned their guns skyward. The sky erupted. The Japanese called it the Red Curtain, a wall of tracer fire that met their attack runs. The 50 caliber bullets tore wings from aircraft, ignited fuel tanks, and shredded cockpits. Survivors spoke of seeing the air itself glow. It was like flying into molten metal, said one pilot captured at Saipan. We were not fighting men, we were fighting a machine that never tired. At Okinawa, 1945, this phenomenon reached its zenith. The Americans had turned the beaches and ships into fortresses of 50 caliber guns. Every landing craft, every tank, every transport truck carried one. When the kamikaze raids began, the Ma-Deuce answered with its full fury. The Pacific sky turned crimson with tracers. One Navy gunner aboard the destroyer USS Stanley wrote, "You didn't aim. You just pulled the trigger, and the whole horizon lit up. It was like the ship was breathing fire." In the final year of the war, the 50 caliber became both a shield and a sword. In the air, it armed P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, and B-17 Flying Fortresses, aircraft that could shred the Luftwaffe from above. On the ground, the same gun created an invisible dome of protection. When the bombers returned damaged from raids, the ground crews who met them were often surrounded by 50 cals ready to repel strafers. The same caliber that tore through the skies over Berlin now guarded the wounded aircraft on their return. German pilots who were captured after the Battle of the Bulge often asked American interrogators about the weapon. One German major said bitterly, "We used to fly low to scare your men. Now we stay high because if we come down, we die. You Americans, you made the air poisonous." The effect was psychological as much as physical. The thunder of the Browning was everywhere. On ships, in jungles, across fields, it was omnipresent, unrelenting. It made the enemy feel hunted even in the open sky. No matter where they flew, no matter how fast, the Americans could answer. And that answer came in half-inch bullets, glowing red in the night. Every soldier who fought beneath those skies remembers it the same way. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt, deep in the chest like standing beside a forge. The smell of gun oil, the vibration of the barrel, the crack of each shot, it was a symphony of survival. It wasn't music, but it was beautiful, because it meant we weren't alone. By 1945, the enemy had learned a truth that no amount of courage could erase. The 50 caliber Browning had erased the boundary between air and ground. There was no safe altitude, no refuge, no escape from its reach. The skies that once belonged to the attackers now belonged to the defenders.
The pilots who once dived with confidence now climbed with fear. And the world, from the beaches of Normandy to the reefs of Okinawa, glowed red with the fire of the weapon that had changed the very physics of war. The Americans called it Ma Deuce. The Germans called it the Red Rain. But by the war's end, everyone understood what it really was. The sound of a nation whose firepower reached from earth to heaven and never missed.
The Browning M2 HB 50 caliber was a marvel of engineering. Steel precision, simple mechanics, brutal elegance. But steel alone doesn't win wars. Behind every burst of fire, behind every glowing tracer that carved through the air, there was a man. A soldier, crouched behind a steel shield or standing upright in the open, hands frozen to a pair of handles, jaw locked against the recoil. The Ma Deuce was his voice, his heartbeat, his defiance. And in every theater of war, those men turned the machine into something more, a living creature of war, half steel, half soul. They called themselves 50 gunners. Tankers, infantrymen, sailors, airfield guards, Marines. Every branch had them. Their weapon was heavy, unwieldy, and sometimes taller than they were. It kicked like a mule and burned the skin off bare hands. The recoil rattled teeth and bruised shoulders. The gun's appetite for ammunition was insatiable, and every 50-round belt weighed as much as a small child. But to the men who carried it, it was worth every ounce. "The 50 never lets you down," one gunner from the 2nd Armored Division said. "If you feed her right, she'll never stop singing." At Normandy, those songs echoed from the hedgerows. In Italy, they roared through mountain passes. In the Pacific, they thundered over coral reefs. Every gunner developed his own ritual. Some tapped the receiver 3 times before loading the first belt. Others whispered the same phrase every time they pulled the charging handle, "Let's go, girl." The relationship was intimate, forged in noise and smoke. To outsiders, the M2 HB was just a gun. To its crews, it was alive. Operating one wasn't easy. The M2 demanded strength, rhythm, and intuition. It had to be cleaned constantly, every spring, every pin, every groove, because a jam at the wrong moment could mean death. The gunners learned to smell the weapon: hot oil, burning metal, the faint whiff of cordite that clung to their gloves. They could feel the difference between a smooth feed and a misaligned round by touch alone. "You didn't look at the gun," said Marine Corporal Jack Harrelson, who manned a deck gun on the USS Johnston. "You felt it through your hands. You knew when it was happy." In Europe, the 50 crews often worked in pairs, gunner and loader. They spoke in short, calm words, even under fire. Feed. Clear. Change barrel. The loader handled the belt, guiding it link by link into the tray while keeping his head low. His world was brass casings and cold air, fingers raw from handling steel. When tracer rounds turned the night red, the loader's face glowed with their reflection. In the Pacific, the conditions were the opposite: heat, humidity, and salt. Guns rusted overnight. Sand invaded every moving part. Marines wrapped their Brownings in oil-soaked rags during the night, then unwrapped them each dawn like relics. They cleaned, oiled, and reassembled them with the reverence of monks. A faulty spring or a loose bolt could cost lives. During one beach assault on Peleliu, a Marine gunner fired so long his barrel turned white-hot and began to droop. His loader shouted to stop. Instead, the gunner poured seawater over the barrel, sending a plume of steam into the air, and kept firing. He said later, "We weren't going to stop while they were still coming." On land, the 50 gunners fought from jeeps, half-tracks, and tanks. On ships, they manned twin or quadruple mounts, swinging their guns in broad arcs to meet kamikazes and torpedo planes. On airfields, they stood sleepless beside the runways, guarding against night raids. There was no glamour in the job, no medals for endurance, no headlines for holding a trigger,
but every inch of ground the Allies gained rested on the steadiness of their fire. The 50 gunners were the backbone of the Allied defense network. When German or Japanese aircraft appeared, they were the first to fire, and often the last to stop. During the siege of Bastogne, paratroopers used their M2s to break up low-flying Luftwaffe attacks. At Iwo Jima, Marine gunner George Tsuboda set up his 50 on Mount Suribachi and poured fire into Japanese caves until his water-cooled barrel split. He replaced it and kept firing. He said years later, "The gun didn't care who you were. It just asked one thing: don't quit before I do." In moments between battles, gunners shared cigarettes beside their machines, the barrels cooling beside them like sleeping beasts. They compared scars, burns from spent casings, bruises from recoil, blisters from swapping barrels. Many carried permanent hearing loss, a constant ringing that followed them for life. "We didn't use earplugs," one vet joked. "The 50 made sure we heard freedom forever." And yet, despite its brutality, the Ma-Deuce had a strange poetry. When it fired at night, its tracers drew red constellations in the sky, a living tapestry of defense and defiance. Pilots high above could see those arcs glowing beneath them like ribbons of fire. It looked like someone painting with light remembered a P-47 pilot who flew over the Ardennes. He felt safer knowing they were down there. But safety came at a cost. In the chaos of battle, 50 gunners were often the first targets. Enemy snipers learned to aim for the flash. Artillery zeroed in on their sound. Many gunners died still gripping the handles, their fingers locked around the butterfly trigger. When medics found them, the guns were often still smoking, still warm. Their comrades would wipe them clean and remount them, because the weapon had to keep working. As one sergeant said, "The gun mourned its man for one burst, then it went back to work." These men were never famous, but they were the silent architects of victory. They built a wall of fire that protected every convoy, every bomber runway, every landing beach. Without them, the skies would have belonged to the enemy. With them, even the most daring Luftwaffe ace or kamikaze pilot had to think twice. In time, soldiers began to say something that captured the truth better than any manual or medal could. The 50 doesn't fight for you, it fights with you. That was the essence of the bond: flesh and steel, endurance and reliability, human will fused with mechanical perfection. Together, they became something elemental, a heartbeat of war that never faltered no matter how dark or cold or impossible the moment seemed. By 1945, that bond had become legend. The Browning M2HB wasn't just a gun anymore. It was the soul of an army, the mechanical heart that refused to stop beating. And as the final battles loomed across the Rhine and in the Pacific, that heart would roar louder than ever. Because for the men behind the guns, surrender was never an option while the 50 still had breath to give.
When the smoke cleared over Europe and the Pacific in 1945, millions of weapons were abandoned, scrapped, or locked away in warehouses. The world's arsenals were full of relics of a war that had burned itself out. Rifles, tanks, and aircraft designs already obsolete by the time peace arrived. But one weapon refused to fade. The Browning M2HB .50 caliber machine gun was not retired, not replaced, not even modified much. It had survived the largest conflict in human history almost unchanged. And in doing so, it had proven something that every soldier who ever fired one already knew. The Ma-Deuce was not just a gun. It was an idea. One so perfect, it would outlive its own century. The stories of its endurance began immediately after the war. In Korea, 1950 through 1953, when snow fell on the mountains of the Chosin Reservoir, American Marines found themselves fighting in temperatures colder than Bastogne. M1 rifles jammed, carbines froze solid, but the M2s, the same guns that had roared on Okinawa, kept firing. Mounted on trucks, tanks and makeshift sandbag nests, they chewed through wave after wave of Chinese assaults. Gunners called it singing in the snow. One veteran said, "You could set your watch to that sound. Every burst meant another minute we were still alive." In Vietnam, it became the thunder that rolled through the jungles. Mounted on Huey gunships, armored convoys, and river patrol boats, the M2 HB once again found itself everywhere. The thick canopy of the jungle couldn't silence its voice. It guarded bases, convoys, and villages, spitting fire down trails invisible from the air. The jungle would go quiet, one door gunner recalled. Then the Ma Deuce would talk, and the trees would answer. Through half a century of warfare, the same weapon followed the same formula: air-cooled, recoil-operated, utterly reliable. Soldiers called it the Old Girl, Big 50, or simply Ma. The name stuck because it fit. Like a mother, it protected everything under its reach: jeeps, tanks, ships, aircraft, men. There was something maternal about the way it covered the battlefield, watching, waiting, punishing anything that threatened its children. The weapon's design was so solid that even as technology advanced, lasers, smart bombs, guided missiles, the M2 remained untouched. The U.S. Army tested new versions, new calibers, new mounts. None lasted. Every replacement failed the same test: reliability. The Ma Deuce never jammed when the world depended on it. As one ordnance officer put it, "It doesn't care if you're in mud, snow, or salt water. It just asks for ammo." Even America's enemies couldn't help but respect it. During the Gulf War of 1991, Iraqi soldiers abandoned vehicles when they saw the telltale flash of the .50 cal's tracers. In Afghanistan and Iraq decades later, American convoys still rolled with M2s mounted on their roofs. The sound was the same as it had been in 1944, a deep, rhythmic hammering that could be felt in the chest before it was heard in the ears. Civilians called it the heartbeat of the convoy. What made the M2 eternal wasn't just engineering, it was philosophy. John Browning's vision had been simple: make a machine that never quits. No excess, no fragility, no compromise. Every spring, every pin, every groove served a purpose. It could be cleaned with motor oil, repaired with wire, fired until the barrel glowed red. It didn't require faith, it earned it. That design philosophy shaped generations of American weapons afterward, from the M60 to the M240, yet none ever replaced her. The Ma Deuce was not the ancestor of those guns, she was their queen. In museums today, the M2HB sits behind glass, blackened steel, barrel worn smooth from decades of fire. Visitors walk by without realizing that the weapon in front of them is likely older than their grandparents, and still used by the same army that carried it ashore on D-Day. Soldiers returning from modern deployments say the same thing their grandfathers did: she's heavy, she's loud, and she never fails. The symbolism of the Ma Deuce runs deeper than its mechanics. It became a sound that defined American warfare, not chaotic, not frantic, but deliberate and steady. When it fired, it spoke of discipline, persistence, and industry. It was the sound of factories in Detroit and Hartford turned into firepower, the echo of a nation that built not just weapons, but endurance. When the M2 fired, the message was clear: we're still here, we're still fighting. In the words of one World War II veteran interviewed in 1989, "We had our rifles, our mortars, our bazookas, but when you heard the 50, you stood taller, because you knew she'd never stop until the fight was done." And so, decade after decade, war after war, the Ma Deuce never left. On guard towers in Afghanistan, her barrel pointed toward the same mountains where Alexander once marched. On Navy ships, she watched over seas where the ghosts of Midway still lingered.
on armored trucks rolling through deserts, her muzzle flared red against the night, the same color it had burned in the skies over Normandy 70 years before. It is rare that a machine becomes immortal, rarer still that it keeps earning its place across generations. Yet somehow, the M2HB did. She outlived her inventor, her century, and even the wars that gave her purpose. And she remains the one weapon every American soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine knows by name. When the final gun of the 20th century is silenced, and history looks back at the weapons that shaped the world, the Browning .50 caliber will not be remembered just for its firepower. It will be remembered for its faithfulness, for being there when everything else failed. Because from Normandy to Okinawa, from Korea to Kandahar, one truth has never changed. The Ma Deuce never stopped speaking. Her thunder still rolls through the ages, a steel heartbeat echoing across time, a reminder that some machines don't just fight wars, they become them.